I want to begin my homily this morning with a question. After hearing the first reading from Amos in Luke's Gospel, how many of you have that feeling that you get when you have a little pebble or a stone stuck in your shoe? You know what I mean? You're walking along and then it moves and it stabs you in the foot and you try to shake it around and get rid of the pain. If only you could find the right spot where it wouldn't hurt anymore. You simply want relief, and it's aggravating. My friends, this is the feeling that we should get when we hear these readings. We're meant to feel discomfort. Go back and look at the reading from famous Amos, not the chocolate cookie guy, the prophet, who's very direct and very indicting about us when we ignore our brothers and sisters in need. His observations of neglecting the needs of the poor set the stage for the parable that we hear from Jesus about Lazarus and the rich man. But you know, if we're not careful, we could look upon Jesus' ministry and think that he's the enemy of the wealthy, couldn't we? At first glance, many times he raises this same issue, and he always seems to be kind of against the rich. We hear about the camel passing through the eye of a needle, and this thread runs out throughout the Gospels. A person who has riches in this life finds it difficult to follow in Jesus' footsteps and to enter into heaven. And today is another prime example of the same kind of story, but it drives home the point in an especially poignant way, because Jesus is speaking to the Pharisees and they have a belief in life after death. And he uses that belief to make a really strong statement about riches and their impediment to a successful spiritual life, doesn't he? He uses life after death in the story in such a way to really make them and us feel uncomfortable. The rich man is described, he's great in wealth, purple garments, fine linen, sumptuous meals. We see that his elaborate wealth, that he lives far above most of the people of his time. And in stark contrast, we have Lazarus, the poor guy, lying on the ground at his door, sores all over his body, and dogs come and lick his sores. And he's hungry. He's truly somebody at the bottom, if you will. You might even say that we're seeing a contrast between somebody really successful in this earthly life, the rich man, and someone who, let's face it, would be called a failure, Lazarus. This is the stage that Jesus set for his audience, and his audience is us. Now comes what I like to call the flip. Jesus usually uses his parables and flips them upside down to make a point. In today's story, he does exactly the same thing. Worldly success is turned into spiritual failure. The rich man ends up in the netherworld, suffering what might be called the pains of hell. And then he takes what we would look at as worldly failure and makes a spiritual success with Lazarus, because he's been welcomed into the bosom of Abraham and he's been carried up to heaven by angels. This is quite an indictment if we just look upon it as the fact that he was rich. But Jesus' message goes much deeper here. The sin of the rich man even continues after he's dead. He's so selfish that he wants to treat Lazarus like a slave and says, tell him to give me some water because I'm suffering so bad. He doesn't even realize the true message that once we're called home, we return to God. We cannot go back and undo our life. There's no do-over in the afterlife. So this part of the story reminds us that what we do day to day really counts in the eyes of God. But what about that question of Jesus' attitude towards the rich? This is not a new message. He knows how difficult it is for someone who is materially well off or wealthy to give credit where credit is due. And it doesn't even take great wealth for this to happen to each of us. To look around and be proud at, look what I have accomplished. Look what I did. And it doesn't take long for us to start taking all of the credit in our lives, and little by little, We lose the humility and the candor that it takes to admit that everything I have is a gift. When it gets right down to it, there is nothing that we can point to that is solely ours on our own merits, that we've accomplished on our own, or more accurately, without God. I could stand up and name accomplishments that I've had in my life and achievements, but you know what? They're all really blessings and gifts from Him. That's the reality. Riches are not the problem. Not acknowledging God as the source of everything and acting according to that knowledge is the problem. That's what the rich man didn't do. He ignored the reality that when he was able to pass by Lazarus day after day, overlook him, not even see him, and ignore him. That neglect leads to the sin that Jesus knows is so easy for you and me to fall into. That neglect is caused by our pride and our selfishness, and it gets in the way of our relationship with a loving and merciful and ever-present God who wants the best for us and blesses us with the grace for everything that we need in this life to serve Him well. Taking it further, if all we have are gifts from God, what are we supposed to do with them? Share them with others, right? That's the solution. To recognize God's ownership over everything and acknowledge that we are stewards of everything He's given us. And it brings us to what is known as God's preferential option for the poor. Have you ever heard that statement before? That's a part of our faith. It's sown and it's a thread all throughout our church history. And it's used to explain what we are supposed to do with these blessings from God. It's the recognition that as children of God, we have a responsibility to use these many gifts not only to provide for ourselves, but for anyone who has a need, period. Just listen to a few of the statements. St. Basil puts it this way: when someone steals another's clothes, we call them a thief. Should we not give that same name to someone who could clothe the naked and does not? The bread in your cupboard belongs to the hungry. The coat unused in your closet belongs to the one who needs it. The shoes rotting in your closet belong to the poor who have no shoes. And the money that you hoard belongs to the poor. Not pulling any punches. Do you feel that pebble in your shoe a little bit? St. Ambrose further explains this theme. He says, you are not making a gift of what's yours to the poor man, but you're just giving him back what is his. You've been appropriating things that are meant to be for the common good of everyone. The earth belongs to everyone, not to the rich. And St. Rose of Lima simply said, when we serve the poor and the sick, we serve Jesus. We must not fail to help our neighbors because in them we serve Jesus. That pebble is getting really uncomfortable. And the more we look through and realize that preferential option for the poor, we realize that that's really the point. And this message is consistent from what Jesus taught to these early church fathers, to our catechism, and right through to Pope Francis. Just read his encyclical Joy of the Gospel. And I'll be the first to admit that even preaching these words and this message to you today, I fall really short in practicing these things. And I suspect that many of you may as well. So, what do we do and where do we go from here? We ask God to help us to form the conscience that we need. When we see and face that homeless person that we see with a sign on the street, or we exit the interstate and see the person standing down at the bottom of the hill, I can't tell you what you're supposed to do. We're supposed to depend on our conscience, well formed, to know how we handle those situations in our lives. The best way to get relief from this aggravating pebble, the best way to stop beating up ourselves for falling short, is to ask God for His grace and His wisdom so that we can just simply do better. He knows. He created us. And He sent His Son to teach us in word and in deed. So we look to Him to inspire us and He does, with the gift of the Holy Spirit, to just keep trying, to just keep moving more and more closely to this unselfish way of life. In a few minutes, we will each receive His real presence in the Eucharist. Let's use that closeness to surrender our shortcomings and seek His strength, His love, and His forgiveness to move forward and share our lives completely with others as Jesus taught us.